Welcome to the debate. When you open the early diary of a musical genius, you kind of expect to find messy, handwritten ideas, right?
Right, yeah. Like scribbles, mistakes, crossed out words.
Exactly. You expect something full of flaws, perhaps, but brimming with the raw, authentic soul of the artist. But what if you open that diary and the handwriting isn't messy at all? What if the pages are filled with absolutely flawless, perfectly executed corporate calligraphy and it's written by someone else entirely?
Oh, wow. That is a really striking image. It's a beautifully packaged illusion that looks like art, but mechanically functions like a cage.
Yes, beautifully said. And that brings us to the hidden prehistory of a true music legend. Today, we are exploring Janet Jackson's 1982 self-titled debut album.
A fascinating and often overlooked era.
It really is. So, the core question we are examining today is this. Should this 1982 record be celebrated as a charming, high-quality time capsule of teen soul? Or should it be critiqued as a tragic void of autonomy where a young artist was entirely stripped of her voice?
Right.
I represent the view that this album is a pristine, beautifully produced artifact of post-disco pop. I mean, it successfully gave a 16-year-old her first R&B top 10 hit. It's sweet, it's historic, and it works.
And I represent the view that this album is a deeply disturbing exercise in familial and corporate control. It essentially forced a teenager to abandon her true dreams for a totally manufactured image.
Okay, well, to really appreciate what this album is, I think we have to immerse ourselves in the sonic landscape of 1982.
Let's set the scene.
So the music industry had just survived this aggressive, even hostile backlash against disco, right? Mainstream pop was sort of in a vacuum, and Black music, specifically R&B, had to rapidly evolve to survive commercially.
Yeah, it was a totally transitional period.
Exactly. And what emerged was this vibrant subgenre known as teen soul or post-disco. It was up-tempo, it was optimistic, it possessed this youthful brightness while maintaining enough musical sophistication to, retain adult listeners.
Right. Acts like Shalimar and DeBarge were really defining the space.
Yes, Shalimar, DeBarge, Evelyn Champagne King. And into this space steps a 16-year-old Janet Jackson. Now, A&M Records didn't just throw her in a booth. They assembled absolute R&B royalty to craft this record.
They certainly spared no expense on the architects, I'll give you that.
Precisely. If you look at the physical structure of the vinyl itself, it is a brilliantly calculated A-B test of pop appeal. On side A, you have the soaring synth-pop and dance tracks driven by the dynamic duo Rene and Angela Winbush.
Aiming straight for the crossover dance floors.
You got it. And then you flip the record to side B, and Foster Sylvers takes over with these heavier funk-tinged tracks designed to anchor her in the core R&B market. I mean, it is a masterclass in manufactured pop.
Manufactured being the operative word there.
Well, sure, but we have to acknowledge that the machinery worked perfectly. The single Young Love broke into the R&B top 10, hitting number 6. The album reached number 6 on the Top Black Albums chart. She brought this genuine, smiling energy to the microphone that resonated profoundly with the Black music market.
Did she, though?
I think so. It's an underappreciated gem that perfectly encapsulates a transitional moment in pop history.
That is, it's a very compelling narrative, but we really have to challenge the entire concept of success here, especially when the artist in question possesses absolutely zero control over her output.
Zero control is a strong phrase.
But it's true. We can marvel at the chart placements and the elite studio polish all day, but the reality behind the microphone is honestly heartbreaking. We are talking about a 16-year-old girl whose true ambitions had absolutely nothing to do with being a pop star.
Right. She wanted to act.
Exactly. Her ambitions were firmly anchored in attending Pepperdine University, studying entertainment law, and continuing her established sitcom career. I mean, she already starred in Good Times and Different Strokes. She had the trajectory of a successful television actress perfectly mapped out.
She was very talented on screen.
She was, but she was operating under the suffocating control of her father, Joe Jackson.
A dynamic that has been heavily scrutinized, of course.
And for good reason. because you have to look at the mechanics of the Jackson family business in 1982. Joe Jackson wasn't just pushing a child into a hobby. He was acting as a CEO trying to diversify a corporate portfolio.
That sounds so clinical.
But that's what it was. The Jacksons as a group were trying to maintain leverage by securing a solo contract for his youngest daughter at A&M, which, importantly, was a completely different label than Epic, where Michael and her brothers were housed. Joe Jackson was creating an entirely new, isolated revenue stream for the family brand.
Well, yes. It was a business move.
But this wasn't Janet's vision. She didn't write a single lyric, she didn't compose a single melody, she didn't co-produce. She simply walked into the studio, sang exactly what the producers instructed her to sing, and walked out as an anonymous vessel. To call it a gem is it's like praising the aerodynamics of a luxury vehicle without mentioning that the driver is locked in the trunk.
Wow. Okay. I hear the tragedy in that framing. I really do. But let's look at the actual sonic result of that studio process, because the vehicle you're describing ran flawlessly.
Flawlessly?
Yes. You cannot deny the immaculate production value. If you listen to Say You Do today, expecting the aggressive, militaristic Janet of the later Rhythm Nation era, you'll be completely thrown off.
Oh, absolutely. It's night and day.
But taken on its own terms, it is a nearly 7-minute, vibrant post-disco masterpiece. You have Bobby Watson from the band Rufus laying down this incredible driving bass line.
It is a great bass line.
Right? And the track perfectly captures that historical transition from the analog instrumentation of the 1970s to the digital synthesizers and polyphonic drum machines that would totally define the 80s.
But see, that transition is exactly what buries her.
I disagree, because she holds her own. The production team brought in Paulinho da Costa for world-class percussion. This wasn't cheap filler, this was elite musical architecture.
It was too massive for her.
No, yes, the drum machines were becoming quantized and rigid, creating this mathematical precision. But her vocal delivery cuts through it. It is full of life, it's energetic, it's smiling, it's credible. She stood in the center of a massive sonic apparatus and anchored it beautifully with sheer charisma.
I come at it from a different way.
Okay, how so?
That immaculate production you're praising, it only serves to mask an empty center. Yes, the session musicians were world-class. Yes, Bobby Watson is a genius on the bass. But when the scaffolding is that massive, it completely swallows the artist if they don't have a distinct musical persona.
She had a persona, though. It was just a young one.
But it wasn't strong enough. Take a technically impressive track on side B, like Don't Miss Up This Good Thing.
Oh, I love that track.
It features this aggressive staccato synth-funk sound. It's complex, it's rhythmically demanding, but Janet is just floating on top of it. She's completely detached from the weight of the groove.
Well, isn't this exactly like a young, talented actor doing a table read for a major studio film? Think about her background. We know she was an actress first, and she approached this album as an actress playing a role.
A role she didn't cast herself in.
Maybe, but the script in this case, the lyrics and the melody, might be written by someone else. The director, the producer, might be telling her exactly where to stand and how to emote. But she is still delivering those lines with a genuine, undeniable star quality.
I just don't hear the star quality yet.
In Young Love, which became that massive teen soul hit, she bridges the gap between 70s soul and 80s pop with such an infectious charm. When she performed it on the legendary dance shows of the era, you could see it. You don't captivate that deeply critical, groove-oriented television audience by being an empty center.
They were looking at a Jackson, though.
But you captivate them by having an innate, radiant charisma, which she absolutely possessed, even if she didn't write the script.
Let's test that acting analogy then.
Okay.
Because an actor's limitations are brutally exposed the second they are handed material that demands a mature emotional core they don't possess. And that brings us to where this album completely falls apart.
Which is?
The ballads. If we look at tracks like Love and My Best Friend or Forever Yours, the structural flaws of this manufactured project become glaringly obvious.
Oh, I wouldn't call them structural flaws.
They absolutely are, because the orchestration does not match the instrument. These tracks are incredibly syrupy and bland.
They're sweet.
The arrangement is heavy.
treacly, and it's weighed down with sweeping strings and adult contemporary cliches. And against that massive emotional backdrop, Janet's 16-year-old voice is painfully exposed.
Painfully.
Yes, she had what critics at the time rightly called an adolescent airiness. Her vocal cords literally had not developed the physical resonance, the weight, or the lived-in emotional depth required to carry these adult lyrical concepts.
Well, she was 16.
Exactly. When a sweeping 40-piece string section swells beneath you, a whispery, airy vocal placement sounds like a mistake. She is entirely swallowed whole by the 80s production. It highlights the absolute absurdity of adult male executives handing a teenager a script about profound adult romantic longing.
Okay, that's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. I don't see her vocal lightness on those ballads as a flaw at all. I see it as the exact defining charm of the entire teen soul movement.
Charm?
Yes, you're demanding the heavy, lived-in trauma of adult R&B from a 16-year-old girl. That wasn't the goal. The innocence of her vocals on a track like Forever Yours is precisely what makes it endearing.
Endearing isn't exactly a high artistic achievement.
But the lightness isn't a failure of vocal technique. It's an authentic reflection of youth. We know what she sounds like later on in ballads where she controls the dynamics and shows incredible lived-in vulnerability. But in 1982, she was a teenager singing about teenage concepts of love.
Written by adults.
But the airiness was authentic to her age. It gave the album a sweetness that perfectly balanced out the heavy staccato funk of the dance tracks you mentioned earlier.
But the sweetness wasn't authentic. It was curated. And that adolescent airiness you're defending wasn't just a sonic choice. It was part of a larger, forced infantilization that we see literally printed on the album cover.
The album cover?
Yes, we have to shift from how she sounded to how she was visually and commercially packaged. Because an artist's visual identity is their first communication with the audience, right? And everything about her presentation was dictated by power structures far above her.
I actually think the visual presentation proves my point about her approaching this as an actor's. Look at the album cover. It's a striking, beautiful photograph taken by Harry Langdon in the Jackson family pool.
It's a nice photo, yes.
It is, and Janet intentionally modeled the aesthetic, that dramatic, submerged look, after early portraits of Elizabeth Taylor. She wasn't looking at other contemporary pop stars for inspiration. She was looking at classic Hollywood royalty.
Right.
She was playing a sophisticated, glamorous role. The water itself adds this dramatic mystery. It shows she had a visual intuition, an actress's eye for iconography, even at 16.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
You're focusing on the water and the pose. I am focusing on the text printed across that photograph. The name on the cover.
Oh, the family name, yes.
Janet explicitly begged A&M Records and her management to leave the Jackson surname off the album. She desperately wanted to be judged on her own merits for her own art, separated from the looming monolith of her family's brand.
Which is completely understandable.
She asked for autonomy in her very name, and she was denied by the label and her father purely for marketing mechanics. They needed to cash in on the bloodline to ensure those initial shipments to record stores. And because her name was forcibly attached, she was subjected to the devastating shadow of Michael.
You're referring to the timing of the releases, which was admittedly quite unfortunate.
Unfortunate is an understatement. It was a media trap. Let's look at the mechanics of that timeline. Janet's debut album drops in September 1982. 2 months later, in November 1982, Michael releases Thriller.
Right. The biggest album of all time.
Exactly. While Janet is struggling to sell 300,000 copies, which A&M considered a massive underperformance for a major label push, her brother is selling tens of millions of copies, literally changing the trajectory of human history week by week.
It was an impossible comparison.
The profound unfairness here is staggering. The media and the public relentlessly mocked her, labeling her as someone simply riding the coattails of her brother. They called her an overnight byproduct of nepotism.
Which was so cruel.
Think about the cruelty of that systemic trap. She was dragged into the family music business against her will. She was forced to use the family name on the cover against her will, and then she was punished by the public for seemingly exploiting the family name. The visual identity wasn't about Elizabeth Taylor. It was about branding a Jackson commodity.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are treating her as a purely passive victim in this machinery. And the historical reality is far more dynamic than that.
How so?
Well, yes, the juxtaposition with Thriller was intense. Being the youngest of 9 children in the most famous Black entertainment family in history carries an unimaginable, crushing pressure. But rather than breaking her, that shadow acted as a powerful catalyst.
A catalyst.
Yes. She watched Thriller explode, and by her own admission later, she felt a profound sense of competitive ambition. She thought, I want to break his records. That doesn't sound like a defeated puppet in a trunk to me. That sounds like a brilliant artist who is quietly observing the mechanics of pop superstardom from the inside, learning how the pieces fit together, and biding her time. Even on the album's closing track, Come Give Your Love to Me, you hear this fascinating guitar soul structure.
That is a very different sounding track.
Exactly. It mixes R&B with aggressive new wave elements. It's experimental. It's pointing a compass toward the future, hinting at the heavy, cross-genre rock and electronic fusions she would eventually unleash years later. The seeds of her ambition are right there in the grooves of the 1982 vinyl.
Look, I will grant you that the ambition was brewing internally, but it certainly wasn't allowed to exist in the boardroom. And the corporate machinery only doubled down on their control after this album underperformed.
Which is true, sadly.
Which brings us to the most vital part of this entire discussion, the undeniable, unbreakable reality that emerges when we step back from the 1982 release and look at the vast timeline of her career.
We are stepping into the domino effect of her discography.
Precisely. Joe Jackson's response to the lukewarm reception of the 1982 debut wasn't to give Janet more creative freedom. It was to tighten his grip. He forced her back into the studio for her 1984 sophomore album, Dream Street, which was an even more catastrophic commercial and artistic failure.
It really was.
It peaked at 147 on the Billboard 200. No hits. Complete apathy from the public. But here's where our two perspectives must align. Because I look at the suffocating control of the 1982 debut album and the disastrous failure of the 1984 album, and I realize something.
What's that?
Without those twin traumas, we would never ever have witnessed the genre-shattering explosion of her independence in 1986 with Control.
I won't deny the trauma of that timeline, but I'd argue that the cage you described taught her the exact dimensions of pop music architecture. She couldn't have dismantled the machine in 1986 if A&M hadn't forced her to study its blueprints in 1982.
Oh, absolutely.
The painful restriction of her youth on this record was the necessary pressure cooker. You need the absolute absence of freedom to understand the precise value of independence.
Right.
When she eloped briefly, it was a practice run at rebellion. But the ultimate rebellion was firing her father in 1985, taking her business away from the Jackson family apparatus, aligning with new management, and connecting with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. She took the pristine pop mechanics she learned on her debut and weaponized them.
It is the ultimate story of cause and effect. The 1982 debut was the necessary silence before the revolution.
I love that phrase.
It is the powerful, almost mythic story of a girl who had to lose her voice entirely to find the strength to scream. When she demands control a few years later, that isn't just pop music. That is the sound of a woman who remembers exactly what it felt like to stand in a vocal booth at 16, surrounded by elite producers and polyphonic drum machines, and be told what to feel.
Gives you chills thinking about it.
Right? She took that void of autonomy, weaponized her frustration, and essentially birthed the New Jack Swing movement. She became an artist who pushed boundaries regarding social justice, politics, and sexuality. And she finally achieved her goal of dropping the Jackson surname entirely, stylizing her first name in lowercase with a period, a complete, unassailable reclamation of her identity.
It's a remarkable trajectory. And it makes you realize that when we study an artist's hidden prehistory, we aren't just looking for early signs of genius. We are looking for the precise moments of discomfort that force the genius to emerge.
Exactly.
The 1982 debut album isn't her masterpiece, but it is an essential historical document. It shows us that true artistic sovereignty isn't granted by executives or family members. It has to be fiercely, sometimes painfully, taken.
And it forces us to reevaluate how we listen to manufactured pop. When we hear the pristine corporate calligraphy of those early tracks, we aren't hearing an artist's soul, we are hearing the walls of the cage being built. But, knowing that she eventually breaks out of that cage, studies its locks, and tears it down, well, it makes the history entirely worth studying.
It brings us right back to that opening thought. The flawless diary written by someone else.
Yeah.
Maybe she needed to see how perfectly they could forge her signature, just so she could learn exactly how to rip the pages out, burn the book, and finally start writing her own story in her own messy, magnificent hand. There is so much more to explore in this material, but we'll leave you to ponder how limitation often breeds the most spectacular revolutions. Thank you for joining us.